on the 30th. So it'd have to be the 23rd
Mike's
or
wrong.
30th.
23rd, I've got a commitment. 30th, I may not, I don't know.
Okay.
Good, we're ready to go whenever you want, Doug.
Okay, I'm ready to go. We'll call the meeting to order. I had not had a chance to see the agenda. I think Pete got it to me later, but because of my email problems, I do have a new email address. We do not see, is there anything that anyone wants to put on the agenda other than what we have at this point?
Yeah, I don't have any draft minutes this time around, but we'll have some for the next meeting.
Okay.
Yeah.
With that, we'll go on to public comment for items not on the agenda, and we can jump right over that since we have no public. Into nothing's listed under the old business. And here we have under new business proposed amendments to our code. And
Okay.
do you want to go ahead on that one, Pete?
Yeah, okay, so at the last meeting, we had discussed, so I should back up. We're in the middle of a code amendment process, and a lot of those code amendments have to do with our housing project, equitable housing, but we're also doing other code cleanup in other chapters of the code, including the public and street trees chapter, which is chapter 12.08, and chapter 1749, which is the Natural Resources Overlay District, and chapter 1741, which is our tree preservation and removal and replanting standards. So if, and those chapters with the most recent changes that are proposed are under review with the Planning Commission right now. So we're on hearing number 6. And as I said, we've mostly been looking at the housing code related stuff, but at the same time, and informed the Planning Commission at the last meeting Monday night that the Natural Resources Committee had already looked at the initial code for the Natural Resource Overlay District. And then after that meeting, we talked to Metro staff because we had some questions from the public and public testimony about fences in the Natural Resources Overlay District. And rather than be ambiguous about new fences in particular, the aim of the habitat title under Metro Code, which we need to be in substantial compliance with, and we are in substantial compliance with right now. But when you read the Metro Model Code, which is something that the cities can adopt or modify as they see fit, the intent of fences, if you're going to have them in that area, is to not be a barrier. And so if you've got 6-foot solid privacy fences, new privacy fences, in the buffer area of a stream or wetland, then that's potentially a barrier to migration or barrier to passage of any kind. And since the majority of our ravines and streams are the migration corridors that we have, the upland corridors are largely what they call exception areas to that code because they're development areas within the UGB. So anyway, what I'm saying is the majority of our natural resource corridors are our wetland corridors and stream corridors, and for that reason, I think it's prudent to add an additional criterion for new fences. And so what we've proposed is that new fences be limited to open split rail design, no taller than 3.5 feet tall. And in addition to the other standards we already looked at, which was if you have disturbance, you've got to replant it. So if you've got any bare area, replant it with native species off of the city's list. And you still got to have that 6-inch clearance from the ground to the bottom rail. And then you can locate posts within the bank of a stream or in a delineated wetland, but you could put posts in the buffer, but they would have to be a split rail fence. As for existing fences, assuming the fence was put there legally or pre-existing to the current code, it could be maintained. If so, what we mean by maintained is, if it falls down partially, it's hard for us to know whether that's, just replacing slats or things like that. But the idea is that you would exempt existing fences and allow those to be maintained as part of the yard area. The other thing that split rail fences can do is to serve to delineate where the actual resource buffer is. So if somebody's got a backyard and we know that part of it is regulated, rather than just walling it off and it still being on the property to neglect it, an open rail fence will at least make them, they'll be visible, and that will be easier for the property owner to see. And if property changes hands in the future, we have a separate requirement that, a covenant controls what can be planted and what can be done within that area. So this kind of follows prior policy that we used to have in 2007. It wasn't written in the code, but we used to add conditions for split rail fences. And I think it's just clearer that way. So we can talk about that issue, or if you have any concerns or questions about that, let me know. And then we can move on to the other chapters. Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to show this for the public. Yeah. And turn the lights down. Okay. So the change that we've made is under page 6 of chapter 1749, under subsection, the subsection is called uses that are allowed outright, and there are several things in there. For example, trails have certain requirements. And then fences are going to be required no taller than 3.5 feet and a split rail or similar open design. And then the other standards that we already talked about. The other thing that we had was this section, this sentence here was previous, which says gardens, fences, and lawns within the natural resource overlay district that existed prior to the time that the overlay district was applied to subject property are allowed to be maintained, but can't expand further into the overlay district. And that was actually in an odd place. That sentence was in the code, but it was up here somewhere under, it's the same sentence under prohibited uses, but it's in a more logical place. It's an actual exempt use. So that would be the only change that we would make in addition to the subsections 2, 3, and 4. I'll zoom in a little bit, which I talked about already. So that one's pretty straightforward, and I don't think there's any real conflicts there with anything. Looking at public and street trees, let me think about this real quick. The public and street trees code section has some clarifications in it. As I think I mentioned prior to the previous meeting, we have clearance distances for trees to be planted from public utilities like street lights and things, and we're specifying that public utilities have a 5-foot clearance for sewer, storm, and water lines and utility meters as well. So all of those clearance distances have to be met, but the total number of street trees that are planted in a new development is still subject to a frontage requirement. So you calculate the entire frontage of all the streets, divide that by 30, and that tells us how many street trees are intended to be planted. And if you can fit them in and still meet these clearance distances, which is sometimes pretty tricky, then we'll find a spot for them.
The
And,
division by 30 is what? What does that do?
well, one tree for every 30 feet of public street frontage.
Okay.
Yeah, and that gives you an overall number.
Yes.
We round up if there's a fraction. And then we find where they can be planted, and if we've got too little space based on these clearances, then we have to take fee in lieu of planting, or find alternative locations for the street trees to be planted, which could include public land within a subdivision, such as a storm pond or a tract, which is rare. Most of the time, developers will opt for the fee in lieu option if there's additional too many trees and not enough space to plant them in. But we'll take the money and it goes into the tree mitigation fund, which seems to be working pretty well, because that money can then be used for the planting throughout the city in whatever location is necessary, and with the Friends of Trees program, as well as what we've been using that money for the last 3 years, and that's been pretty successful.
Because they do the planting and kind of keep up on the monitoring too.
Yeah, it's actually really good because they do a lot of the outreach, education, and follow-up that the city staff doesn't have the time or resources or expertise to do, including, putting out door flyers, contacting the neighbors, figuring out what trees they want, working with our Public Works Department to get the locations figured out ahead of time, and spray painting a mark on the sidewalk or the curb. And then we have a yearly contract with them, but we actually go into a 2-year contract so that it's not as much administrative work now. And they've been working here for 3 years and really know our system pretty well. I don't want to go too into this topic because there's a lot of other details involved with that, but some property owners have asked if they can use a Friends of Trees money to replace a tree that they want to remove. And we've said no, because that's not what the purpose of it is. The purpose is to provide a new tree, not to compensate for removed trees. And so, but Friends of Trees understands that policy as well and communicates that to the owners, the abutting property owner. So that is the only change in 12.08, in addition to the ones we discussed before. But basically what we've said is that maintenance for street trees includes watering during dry periods. So it's just more of a making explicit what maintenance actually includes. And then referring to a clear vision areas chapter, which is a separate chapter of the code that talks about vehicle sight lines across corners. And the Public Works Department gave input on this issue, so we wanted to maintain clear vision for traffic safety. And then we've also added what is acceptable for a species selection. Firstly, we refer to Oregon City adopted street tree list, a recommendation of a certified arborist, or an approved tree list for a jurisdiction in the metropolitan region. We're saying that trees shall be approved from an associated franchise power line utility company in this sentence, but at the same time, I want to make this last sentence here is going to be debated a little bit more with PGE, because they have a sort of a limited list and we have a much broader list. And we would like to keep our list as broad as possible.
Yeah.
And I don't want that to trump what the city has been doing with our street tree list, which is to provide better options and more options. So that's an ongoing discussion. I should also mention, I gotta do this thing. I should also mention that PGE did enter a record, into the record, a letter requesting that they be allowed to take care of nuisance trees and trees that are volunteer species in the right-of-way without a permit or replacement. And we've said that we haven't formally responded to that yet, but our policy and what we're going to say to the planning commission is that we don't want to do that. We still want to treat all trees in the public right-of-way as public street trees, whether or not they've been formally planted. And, you know, there's several options, such as, you know, as long as we are meeting the intent of the code, which is to maintain canopy cover within the public right-of-way, we think we can meet the intent of what PGE is worried about, which is public safety and clearance from power lines, and have some sort of a expedited review process for them, but we don't want to wholesale remove exempt them at this point. So that's going on. And if you had any input on that, I'd appreciate it.
I have a question.
Yeah.
And underground, PG underground utilities, do any of them go into the parking strip, under the parking strips at all? And if so, is permission required to plant the trees there?
Yeah, well, one of the requirements has long been that new development is required to put the utilities underground unless PG determines that it's not feasible. So that policy is usually enacted, and if they do put the utilities underground, they're usually placed in a vault, within an easement, and deeply enough that it doesn't conflict with the street trees.
So there's no requirement that somebody has to check with PGE to actually put the trees in the parking strip?
Well, that's the other, thanks for bringing that up. PG is asked to be a party to the review of the street tree plans for new development. And I'm fine with that, because then
And that's currently
we
not
get it
in the
early.
code, though.
Pardon?
That's not currently in the code?
It's not in the code right now. It's more of, it should be a policy and I think it would help to codify that. So I think we've added that to the other development review chapter, and it isn't in here, but it's our chapter 1612, which is our procedures for development review for all development. And it's more of just a policy, is including PGE. Yeah. Because that way we get out ahead of it well ahead of time, and that's really what they want to do. So we all are on the same page as to what species is there, and
Are there maps where people can go to determine whether there are utilities in the parking strip?
the best thing to do in that case is contact the us in Public Works, because we have the as-built utility plans for all of the development, and or easement documents that should indicate that. And then it's not online. That stuff is on record in the Public Works Department. And so that one. Adding a provision that the Public Works Department and Parks and Rec Department may recommend to the Community Development Director the removal of any tree or part thereof which is in an unsafe condition or which is injurious. But then we're also stipulating that those trees be replaced in accordance with this chapter or the natural resources chapter, if the tree is in the NROD. Yep, and I think what we talked about at the last meeting was what the stipulation would be for diseased or hazardous trees. We did separate out the diseased tree definition and hazardous tree definition separately in the code. And the replacement requirement is 1 for 1 if it's diseased or hazardous. And we're also codifying what our policy currently is with respect to sidewalk mobility tripping hazards, which is any lip of a half an inch or more may be removed, the tree may be removed and replaced without having to get a certified arborist report at a 1-to-1 ratio, because that's such a prevalent problem. And we've been using that policy for the last 6 years. 7 years, I think. So most of that is just codifying it is all codifying existing policy. More flexibility for the owners, assurance that the trees are replaced, and it's just clearer. And those are the changes to 12.08. And then the chapter that deals with tree preservation on private developing properties, so anything that's going through subdivision, partition, or site plan and design review is subject to this chapter. And rather than calling it the tree protection chapter, we're renaming it tree protection, preservation, removal, and replanting, which is kind of a mouthful, but that's what it's for, and that's what it's about. Until the time that we do, as a city, decide to adopt a full, I'm not sure if this will ever happen because it could take a lot more process, a lot more public process, and more resources. Until the time that we decide to go with an on-site permitting process for all property within the city, then this is the chapter that we rely on. So if you're a private residential property and you're not doing any development and you're not next to a stream and you're not on a slope, we don't require a permit to remove a tree. But if you want to do something with your property and do in a land use action, then this section of code kicks in, and it applies the moment you submit your land use application. So people do, as we know, the difficulty is people do remove trees in advance of a land use application, and we haven't been able to solve that or address that issue yet. But it allows the property owner to do what they want with their property within the guidelines that we've currently got, as long as they don't violate our natural resource overlay standards and our steep slope overlay standards. So we're thinking much more in being an incentive rather than a regulatory approach in that regard right now. Anyway, so as far as this section of code goes, we had a listing. Basically, we have all these options in our code, and it's a fairly long section. All of those options are currently still available. What we have decided, and I wanted to talk to you, the Natural Resources Committee, about this idea. We currently require that all replanted and saved trees be protected by a permanent restrictive covenant, which essentially functions like a tree permit, but it's extremely difficult to administer. Property owners don't even know when they have a covenant recorded against their property, because once they buy the house, they kind of put the title work in a drawer and forget about it. So the trees will frequently be cut or not, and unless there's a code enforcement action, we don't know about it. And we don't have the resources to go around and look at all the properties that have covenants and that sort of thing. So we require the trees be planted, but I think what we're recommending is that that covenant requirement go away. And rather than do that, we would substitute this with a policy where we inform the property owners that there are covenants, either through a mailing or just letting people know on the website which subdivisions have trees planted in them and what the requirements are, and incentivize people to maintain them properly. I think that's much more workable than the current situation.
Within the new development, people have the trees, or I'm a little confused.
Yeah.
They can't remove them without permission from the city?
Yeah, so prior to a land use application, you might have a large lot with a house on it.
No, well, no, I was talking about once the development's gone in, the trees are there.
Yeah, they're not allowed to remove them at that point. It's kind
But
of
is
free.
this, but is this the covenant here? Is this
So-
what you're striking out?
Yeah, so basically the way it goes is a developer will come in and apply for a land use action or a subdivision, and they will identify the trees that they need to remove in order to do the subdivision. And then based on how many trees they remove, we require a certain number be replaced, and we ask the developer which lots they're gonna replant on. And if they're going to replant on all the lots in the subdivision, then there's a blanket covenant that protects the new trees in the subdivision. And it runs with the land so that the owner of that new lot in that subdivision is required to maintain that new tree in perpetuity.
But I guess my question is here, is this removing that requirement?
It's removing that requirement, yeah.
So then then anyone can just remove a tree then at that point, if they wish to?
And I understand it's difficult to enforce. I mean, people probably cut down trees all the time and nobody knows it. And by the time they cut it down, somebody reports it, it's too late anyway.
Right,
Yeah,
that's exactly right.
Well, I guess I would suggest something else. Since these trees were there and their presence there are from a mitigation originally.
Yeah.
If they remove them, why not require a mitigation, either perhaps a payment for it that could go into your tree fund or something, as opposed to saying you don't have any responsibilities whatsoever.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think we can probably write it better than it is right now and just say,
I mean, I don't want to be that restrictive on a person that owns a place in terms of what they can do with the trees or not, but it seems to me that if you had the requirement to begin with on the developer, then perhaps there should be some mitigation in place that the property owner themselves.
that might work actually really well, because people much prefer, when they call the planning department and ask whether the tree can be cut down, we can probably just check and look back at the subdivision route and say, well, that tree was planted as a mitigation tree and it does need to be replanted.
And the city can make a determination
And we
where
can-
it goes if they're willing to pay money
Yeah.
for that
Yeah.
litigation.
Yeah, that might work, and then we could probably issue some sort of a free permit like we do for street trees.
And then also, if say that tree is 20 years old now, when the person
Yeah.
says they want to remove it,
Yeah.
do they pay a mitigation on a 1-to-1 ratio? Or now that that tree
Well, it
has
depends
gotten
on the
girth and
condition of the
height?
tree, and, that's where it starts to get difficult, because you have to understand what the condition of the tree is, whether it's dead, diseased, dying, or hazardous. Even if it's healthy, it could be hazardous. And I think we would probably want to go with the same mitigation ratio that we apply to street trees in that situation. just out of a sense of equity and fairness. So, because, you know, if you get a 20-inch tree and it is dead, diseased, and dying or hazardous, and you're suddenly required to replant 6 new 2-inch caliper trees, then you're really starting to over-regulate someone's property.
No, I can understand that. I mean,
Yeah.
if it's dead and diseased, but if someone says,
Yeah.
well, you know, I kind of want to add on to this little area, but that
Okay.
tree was I want to add on a steady, but that was a mitigation tree.
Okay.
And now we want to cut down this 20-year-old tree on the side of our house. New owners, what do we do about it? And it's a
Yeah.
perfectly healthy tree.
Well, in that case, we probably want to refer, you know, I think what we would do is recommend referring to this table or 12.08, which is the separate table that we have, which specifies whether the tree is, yeah, I think we'll have to come back to you with a proposal on that, in that regard, and rewrite something.
Yeah, because like I said,
Yeah.
you're trying to make it more convenient for everybody, but at the same time, you don't want to overcomplicate it either, so.
Okay, yeah. Well,
And if you're telling somebody that they cut down a 20-inch tree and they have to plant 9 trees in that area, they may not have room in their yard to plant 9 trees.
right. And our tree mitigation, you know, numbers, our cost for that right now is about $328 per replaced tree. So that would be difficult for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So, okay, yeah, that's good input. I think what we can do is come back with a revision to this, and it will, you know, there's time.
Okay.
And run that by you at the next meeting. Yeah, that's good. Oh, yeah, so that's that part. Yeah, nothing else has really changed. Yeah, there's significant parts of this code that have never really been used by the development community, such as what we thought might be a good incentive, which is which we're keeping in case it does prove to be an incentive in the future, is permitted modifications to lot size to protect trees, and it allows pretty significant reductions in lot size to preserve trees. And I think this is, it's not required. It's, and it's been in the code for about 10 years. But we do see in Park Place, for example, there are some lots that have large oak trees that we've had a pre-application conference where the property owner wanted to preserve the trees, but he also wanted to subdivide the land. And the developer, the engineering firm that he's got are planning to set aside a tree tract and use this provision to reduce some of the lot sizes. And for this specific purpose. And this would override any section of the code that has to do with lot averaging, because it has an express purpose here, which is protection of trees. And it's very specifically written. It has tables and it has lot widths and depths, and tells somebody exactly what the minimums are that they can reduce and how many lots it applies to. It can apply across all the lots, or it can apply across some of the lots, but they still have to average out to the minimum lot size in the subdivision. They get to include the tract in that calculation, which helps. It's complicated, but it works in theory. Okay, so that's all of that. And The next planning commission meeting, and I don't expect there to be a decision, the next planning commission meeting is scheduled for the 24th and of this month, and the next one after that is the 8th.
Oh, is any of this going before the planning commission yet?
Yeah, all of the information that is currently black underlined and black strike through has been to the planning commission, but it's a lot of material. And there's been more discussion about the housing codes things yet. So, the new red colored font has not been before them, but it'll be going before them on Monday, or we'll be publishing it on Monday for the next meeting.
Now, I presume it's in a different part of the code. Where's the heritage tree piece?
Oh, yeah, that's chapter 12.32, which is a separate chapter that we're not changing, unless you wanted to take a look.
Well, we've had the concerns in terms of the cost of an arborist and all those kinds of
Right.
things.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah,
we've had those discussions before.
yeah.
And I don't know if that's the barrier for people not to declare trees heritage trees. We've just
Okay.
had so few of them.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I mean, maybe people are just simply not interested. I don't know.
It's probably a little bit, I would say it's probably having the restrictive covenant on their property for it, and then having the cost of the arborist too, would be my guess.
Yeah.
So,
Since I've knocked off
That's a
probably
cost and a-
$1,000 at
Some-
least.
I mean, some
That's
people,
what I've heard.
oftentimes the owner itself likes the tree and does want to put that covenant essentially on it to preserve the tree. That was the case in my case, and one of the reasons a person bought the house was it had a protected
Yeah,
tree.
that was unique.
So,
So I can see some of it, but I can see it the other way around though too.
yeah, I know, and, but from the standpoint of, if it's determined to have a disease ultimately, they can go ahead and cut it down. I mean, that's already there, and and I know we had that issue, that beautiful sugar maple there on I don't know, it wasn't Monroe, but.
7th, down 7th Street?
Seventh in the corner, yeah. That I guess was disease, it had.
Yeah.
It
had
had
interior
wind damage, and then I could see the interior of the tree actually had some problems with it too. But, I mean, that's my big concern.
And that tree had been looked at many times.
Yes.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
it wasn't a neglected tree, it was one that was actively trying to be
Yeah.
saved.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like if we're requiring the property owner consent to the nomination, then the property owner really ought to have the right to, deal with the consequences of the tree, and the city not really. The difficulty is, once you've designated the tree as a heritage tree, the city's going to assume some role in its protection in the future, and the city wants some assurance that it's worth preserving from a health standpoint. But at the same time, the ultimate obligation for its care lies with the owner, or probably should lie with the owner in the absence of any other resources that the city can provide. So if we remove the requirement for a arborist report, I don't know that, it would probably incentivize a certain number of new trees to be nominated. I know the Clackamas County program doesn't require that. What they do though is they have a deadline for the nominations, and they designate all the trees in a particular year at the same time. And it's a little simpler, it's a lot simpler.
Do it in bulk, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know if they go through have a committee recommendation or not, but that might be another approach as well. Gosh, I didn't even think about that, Doug. We could come back with some revisions to 12.32.
Could we ask the county how they do it, why they do it in lots? Maybe they have a secret system that is working and we can adopt some of those.
It's very simple.
Yeah,
It's
And-
really simple. It's basically, there's no requirement for a covenant. It does require owner consent. They do a batch every year and,
Well, it makes it easier also for people to make the nomination for heritage trees on public land. I don't know if somebody makes that
well,
nomination.
theirs doesn't apply to public land. It's all private.
Well,
I should
well,
have mentioned that.
Yeah. But if a person makes a nomination of a tree on public land to the city,
Yeah.
are they responsible for hiring the arborist to do it?
That, we haven't figured that one out yet, have we?
yeah, because we talked about
We do, yeah.
doing
But
the cemetery park.
this would do sort of away with that problem. The city could make a determination whether they felt
They
there was
still
an
have to
issue with it.
consent to it, right? Yeah.
And so,
Okay.
I mean, because we have two trees on public property that have letters of recommendations, everything. And now since then, they have expired.
Yeah.
But that was at the
Yeah.
pool.
Yeah.
And one of those trees, they asked not to put on the Heritage Tree Program. That's the big sequoia, because it's going to eventually hit that wall and damage the retaining wall.
Okay.
And, but in the meantime, the two others, trees are
Right.
now, one was a Moroccan pine, and the other one is a beautiful Jerry oak.
Yeah,
But
all right. Okay.
then are they
Totally.
heritage
no,
trees?
it's no, because
in limbo?
it's in limbo, and actually it's timed out because it's over 60 days. We had like 4 applications timed
Yeah,
out.
because when we rewrote that code, we kind of copied all this procedure from the land use process, which might not have been a good idea, but it seemed like a good idea at the time, because we wanted to.
Take
expedite
a look
the
and
process.
see if all that can be simplified,
I think it can be
including trees on public lands.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be nice maybe if we can do it in a blanket section.
yes.
Say, okay, we can audit the cemetery, and maybe we can take a whole group of people and some people with real tree knowledge.
And anything on
know.
public land, of course, the city can say no.
Yea or
right,
nay.
For specific
Yeah.
reasons.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that you're right. It's time to revisit that code section. Yeah. So let's put that on the next agenda.
Okay.
We'll work on it in the meantime. And see where we can go. Thanks. Yeah. All right. Any other questions about this?
But you say these amendments are going to be seen in the next couple of meetings by the planning commission?
Yeah, the 24th, and then the other code is taking such a long time to get through because it's a lot of housing code stuff, and I think the earliest the planning commission will make a decision is, and I don't know that this is going to happen, but October 10th, and that would be a recommendation to the city commission, but there would always be an opportunity for amendments after that as well. Yeah.
Is it possible to get some of the things we talked about here done in time for the planning commission to see it?
I think for the 10th, for the 10th of
Okay.
October, but I'm not sure we can get it before you as a group, before.
No, I understand, but
Yeah.
as long as these recommendations are, if you're concerned getting them into it.
Right, yeah.
And we'll try to just follow.
Yeah, and then if
it comes to the planning commission.
Yeah, there would be adequate time for them to review that.
Okay.
Yep,
Thanks.
good deal. Where am I? I got 3 screens going. Okay, so that's the only section of the agenda that I have something formal. I do have other stuff for communications I wanted to share with you. Do you want to move to the next item?
Yes, please, which is under staff report, I guess.
Yeah, communications.
And so,
Do you want me to do mine and then?
Yes, let's
Okay.
do that.
Okay, right, so the next item is something that we've been talking about doing, but not part of this code revision process, which is including the wetlands. There are 4 wetlands that we've agreed to include within the natural resource overlay district that are not in the natural resource overlay district on the heels of this current code update. Not part of this current code update, but because this code update was not intended to change any maps that the city had. And under the natural resource code, changing the natural resource overlay district map is a legislative action that has to go through this planning commission process, and the city commission has to make the approval again. And it applies the buffer that's applicable to the wetlands, which is 50 feet, or depending on the slope next to it, it could be more. And it applies to the Kenema wetland that we've been talking about. It applies to 2 other wetlands, and the Myers Road extension, which is a road project that Public Works is working on and has a delineated wetland for on the Saunders property near the college, where the road extension would come through and touch. There's a wetland there. And so it would apply to that wetland as well. So we would want to bring that to you as well in 2018 or early 2019. So that would do that one. And do we want to talk about the signage, Doug? The stream signage? You'd asked for a list of,
Yes, I guess I was confused. It wasn't intended for this discussion.
Oh,
Somebody
sorry.
had called me up about a specific stream,
Yeah.
and I could not recall the name of one of them, and that it wasn't intended to be on this agenda.
Okay.
You're just supplying me the information.
yeah, okay, got it. So, the other thing is, we haven't done our review of our work plan for some time. On our work plan, we have a timeline to talk to the city commission in advance of their retreat for items that we would like to be included as in the city commission budget, in the budget cycle for the upcoming year. And that's going to be in October, which is coming up. What we've done in previous years, as you recall, is, given a brief presentation and update to the city commission, and then include in their packet all of the agenda items that we've been discussing for the year since the last update. And then that sets the stage for further discussion as they go into the retreat in January, or whenever it is, late December, or is it early January? Early January.
Well, it had to be early January.
Yeah.
Well, they have to be sworn in, so it had
That's
to be
right.
January.
So that's coming up on October 17th. And just wanted to give you a heads up about that. So you and I can talk, and Trent, because you're both listed on the work plan as making that presentation.
I might be ill that day. So that's the 17th of
Of
October?
October, yeah.
Okay.
And Laura asked me about that today, so.
Okay, we could,
Yeah.
we probably, a good thing to review that, and we'll have a meeting before that, just before that.
Well, we haven't had a work session in a while, and, depending on how you all feel, we could schedule a work session outside of our regular meeting time. That's fine by me. But we need to talk schedules.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me just ask this question. Is having a work session an hour before this meeting possible for people here, or do they have work problems that would inhibit that?
Yeah, it would be tight, but
Yeah, I think I could do it.
It'd be fine with me, but
Yeah.
Yeah, Matt?
It'd be tight.
That'd be good because then we could talk through the 12.32 code as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
I mean, the alternative is we could go ahead and extend this meeting, to just shift it back an hour. And it ends up maybe it's going to 10 and have the work session at 7. Would that be better for you?
That would be horrible for me. 4:30 is really early in the morning.
no, 6:15
I'm in
works
bed
for
by
me.
now.
so-
Okay, all right, okay. Yeah, we'll do it that way then, set one for 6 before our next regular meeting.
Okay.
Especially, I don't know if we have a
That'd be
shorter agenda
October 9th.
too, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we can kind of tweak some of those.
Okay.
That'll be October 9th then?
Well, yeah. Let's see. October 10th.
Oh, 10th, sorry, I do that every time.
Okay.
Yeah, why, sometimes I show up on
Let's see.
Tuesdays.
Yeah, that's right. October 10th. Yeah. Okay. And let's see, what else have I got?
That's my calendar.
Update on the Willamette Falls Legacy Project. So, there, as you probably all know, there's been a little bit of a delay in the schedule because after we unveiled the design in June 2017, we worked through the details with the property owner, Falls Legacy LLC. We're still moving forward with Falls Legacy LLC. They have signed the Riverwalk permit applications to the Corps of Engineers, and they've paid their back utilities and taxes and authorized the city to apply for all the Riverwalk permits, which is part of their obligation as the owner and what they already agreed to. And then those initial permits were submitted in May, and we expect the permitting process to take 18 to 24 months.
The
So-
speed of going.
Yeah.
And this is a public partnership. The city is committed to act in the best interest of all the Oregonians who've been involved in the process. And we're taking our responsibility as the stewards of that money very seriously. We've learned last month, that Falls Legacy LLC entered into a contract to sell the Willamette Falls site to a private party. That private party is doing due diligence, so we can't reveal who they are. We're committed to working with that property owner, current or future, to see Riverwalk become a reality. It's not anticipated that ownership change would alter any of the obligations. And so if you have any more detailed questions about that, there is some further background information about it, but that's where it's at right now. Okay, so that's going on. And that's all I have, unless you have some other questions for me about things. Thanks.
Good. We'll go to the round table. Anybody that wants to report on any activities related or reasonably related to our.
I've been so busy, I can't tell you how many things I've done. I have to go over my calendar. Can you choose me last?
Okay.
I've had some conversations with people after, I think it was our July meeting, we'd had the presentation by Pete about the new revised codes and stuff, so it was interesting being able to actually have a conversation with people, kind of inform them a little bit and say what I understood from it and all that, so that's kind of where I've been at.
Yeah, I've been heavily involved in that. We've had a lot of work sessions, a lot of meetings. We had a project advisory team recommendation at the end of July, and then we started the public hearing process. So we've had 6 work sessions of the Planning Commission, 6 public hearings so far. It is a pretty progressive set of code packets, code amendments, because it allows a lot more diversity in housing. in existing zones. We've done our best to try to analyze what the potential for people taking advantage of these code amendments is, but it's very difficult to know because it's dependent on so many factors. The basic idea behind these code amendments is that they provide more opportunities for smaller what we call missing middle housing. So more accessory dwelling units that are limited in size, things such as cluster housing, which is a smaller footprint, allowing townhomes and what we call 3 to 4plexes to be built in medium density zones, and also allowing corner lot duplexes in low density zones in the city. And by low density, I mean the R10, R8, and R6 zones, which are 10,000, 8,000, 6,000 square foot lots. There was very, very strong, I would say, almost unanimous public support for a lot of this coming out of because we really had a good cross-section of people that we don't normally see come to meetings and on the project advisory team. So as we went through the process, we had code amendments going before the project advisory team, but also explaining at a sort of a big picture level what that code amendment actually does. Because code can be complicated and we didn't want to get too bogged down in the weeds. What we're dealing with right now, as we work through this process, is things like parking requirements for these unit types, and whether or not there ought to be owner occupancy for accessory dwelling units, and if we require that, which we do currently require under the current code, but our consultants have said that that is clearly a barrier to getting those built. The concern is that they end up being more rental units, but there's nothing in the zoning code that regulates tenancy of a housing unit.
So when you talk about owner occupancy on the ancillary units, you're talking about the ancillary unit itself being owned?
Either the ancillary unit or the main house. For currently what it's required is 7 months out of the year, the owner has to live in one or the other. So that it doesn't become just a rental property. But what people need to understand is that there's no other requirement like that for any other housing type in the entire city. So we don't know if stuff's being owned or not.
What's the problematic aspect of it being a rental piece?
I think it's more of the idea that it might have, that has not been specified to me. I think what people are concerned about is properties not being maintained well, which is really a nuisance issue rather than a
Well, that might be,
zoning issue.
if the owner of the lot and
Yeah.
the main unit isn't maintaining it, it's probably not maintaining its own property either. I mean, so,
Exactly, which becomes a, and that could apply to any other housing type in the
Yeah.
city as well. But it's a topic of debate, it's still going on. The planning commission's current feeling about that is to keep it. That was not what the PAT recommended, but we're working through that. Yeah.
I thought there was one thing that was interesting when I was listening to the meeting
Yeah.
online, was that there was quite a debate about whether the alleyways should be included
Oh,
and
lot
as
coverage,
part
yeah.
of the lot property when they're really public streets.
Yeah.
And I
understand
thought,
that.
oh, I wish I was there to give my 3 minutes on that.
Yeah. Well, Alex.
Because that was really quite split in the,
Yeah.
and
We have long had the provision that you could count alleys towards your lots because they typically affect higher density development, and the developer already has to dedicate land for a public street, and now we're requiring you dedicate additional land for the alley in the back, which is a more traditional type of development that you see like in the McLaughlin district. Anyway, there's clearly some desire on the planning commission to clarify that. And just say, unambiguously, you don't get to count that.
But does that count to lot size, or is it actually making part of
Under
the
current
buildable?
code, it counts, half the alley counts towards the lot size on one side and half.
But it doesn't mean they can build the ancillary unit into the alleyway.
No, the
They can
setbacks
take
all
that
apply.
into account of the square footage.
Yes,
Yeah,
And,
of the lot.
So I thought that was kind of an interesting,
Yeah. It's more of a, it's like, we want people to build alleys. Public Works has some problem with alleys. It's a little controversial. They're not wide enough to really put utilities in. They only
But
serve
the
as a-
point is, they relieve some of the parking on the main streets.
The biggest
That's-
advantage is they relieve the parking lot on street.
Yeah.
You can put your street trees in. You don't have a whole bunch of driveway cuts if you require the access from the alley. And that's a really nice feature when you've got townhomes or smaller, narrower
Yeah.
lots all lined up. It definitely makes the street a lot easier to plan.
and you can see in our city where people have absconded with their alleyways and just built on
Yeah, it's all kinds of,
retaining walls and everything else.
it runs the gamut, doesn't it? It's like really nice paved ones and everything else. Yeah, so that's going on. But, and the other part of the alley conversation is, just, I think the recommendation was to only require alleys in the new concept plan areas.
Well, one thing, in terms of getting this tree code amendments, in terms of mitigation of trees, if they're cutting down trees then to build, which possibly they are, you might want to consider that actually those trees get mitigated too.
I'm sorry,
In other words, if they're on their own property cutting down trees to put in another unit,
oh,
an
right,
ancillary unit,
yeah, ancillary unit. Yeah, the applicability of the 1741 code. Yeah, I mean, there's some language, for example, in the street code that requires street improvements when you build 50% or more, but we specifically wanted to exempt ADUs from that so that we could get more of them built. Because there's only, in 14 years, there's only been like 23 legal ADUs built that we
Yeah, my point is, could we have the mitigation regulations that we have on trees that are cut down to put in the ancillary unit? Does that apply?
No, it wouldn't, because it would be just a building permit. If you come in for a building permit, you're not changing the use of the lot. We don't consider an accessory dwelling unit changing the single-family neighborhood, the principal
Well,
use.
when you have a new development, my understanding is if you, within the building envelope, you mitigate 1-to-1, outside you mitigate at a different rate.
When you do
Why would not a building of an ancillary unit have the same mitigation standards as they're removing
Yeah.
the tree?
It doesn't currently.
It's just like,
But that's,
Yeah.
well, I'm recommending that.
Yeah,
if
you're
you're looking-
recommending that.
If you're looking
Right.
at that, and we're looking at the same time, mitigation.
right,
Why, I mean, if you're gonna require a developer that's putting in a house to mitigate for the trees that are being removed for the building of that house, why would you, the mitigate, I mean, it can be simply payment to the city, but why wouldn't you have mitigation for an ancillary unit being put in?
and because we might lose some significant large old trees in these.
Yeah, so if it actually expanded the building footprint, if they were just converting a garage or something like that,
No, I'm talking about a new unit going in.
yeah, okay.
I mean,
That's a good answer
that is
for you. I
possible under the ancillary unit. Somebody could build up to an X 1,000 square foot unit on their property if the size permits it, right?
Well, they're limited in, the maximum size you can build is 800 square feet.
Yeah, in any case, they still
Yeah.
might be removing a tree to do that.
They might be, yeah.
Yeah, it's a fairly good sized footprint.
But that would only apply to developments that had trees that had been mitigated for already on.
Well, I think what Doug's recommending is we have an additional provision that applies to
New,
ADUs, but essentially that is, now what you've done is, if you did do that, now you've applied that chapter 1741 to a building permit. So if you apply it to a building permit just for ADUs, Are you going to apply it to an infill lot for a house? Are you going to apply it to an addition for a house? I think that's what you're saying. And it becomes applicable to any addition or what size? I don't know. That's the kind of thing that we have to.
And then also, you're saying that it would be discouraging for somebody because they are financially would have to pay the mitigation, but they're also making financially quite a gain to value of their property, and they're laying a lot of money out for it already. So it's not like they're not already looking at a big bill, so that they would be gaining.
Okay.
But if we're doing this for removal of any tree?
Fine.
For building an ancillary.
To do an ancillary unit, any tree, we would be
Any
requiring
tree within the
mitigation.
building envelope.
So you're saying somebody can't cut down their own tree to do an ancillary unit on there if there's
Well,
no,
the way it works under the current code is if it falls in the building envelope, there's one level of mitigation. If
Okay.
it's outside it, there's another. So it would
Okay.
be slightly less mitigation requirement
Okay.
depending on the diameter of the tree.
But in this case, the outside won't apply.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's-
You know it's in a building.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Okay. That would affect 1741 of the code. So we would want to, we could talk, yeah. We have to write in the applicable section, applicability section of the code and talk about it with the planning commission and you all. So we can talk about that on the 10th as well. It's a fairly easy section of code to write. It's like a couple of sentences, really. Yeah. And I don't think, with the objective of these housing code amendments being removal of barriers, I don't think something like that really falls under a barrier. It's not that big an issue unless it's a really big.
How much, if they're mitigating within the envelope a tree and they're doing it with cash,
Right.
what's the cost? Do you know?
Well, let's say it's 6 trees and, each tree's $330 and, that's $1,800. Yeah, which, it doesn't capture the full cost of environmental benefit of a tree over the long-term life of the tree, cooling, savings, all of that ecosystem service stuff that people talk about. None of that is really reflected in that cost. That cost is strictly reflecting the purchase price, cost of transportation, and planting time.
Right, and that's fine.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's the way it's set right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good. Thanks.
Yeah. That was your communication? That was your communication.
well, I've been talking with a bunch of people about it, so.
Yeah, that's good.
Now the question, interesting conversation.
The whole code thing and has really stirred up a lot.
If this is, it's a little bit new, and if you want to bring this back at the next meeting and put it in your regular.
It's all good.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's good. I'm glad that you're bringing this up because I feel like there's so much in this code package that certain things are inadvertently being overlooked, and that's one of them. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Trent.
Yeah, I don't have any code recommendations. At least at this time.
I'm gonna be up all night.
Yeah, I know. I guess I we were talking about it. Chapter 1.
You didn't know code could be that fascinating, did you?
I think I'll look some new one up. No communications currently.
Okay. Nancy?
I don't have any either at this time.
It's just a couple things. I try to keep you up to date on the activities of the Greater Oregon City Watershed Council. We got a couple things. One of which, in conjunction with the Parks and Rec, we'll be hiring a group to deal with the invasive species on Abernathy Creek Park. we've been very frustrated by any plantings that we have because serious problems, not as much with the English ivy, although we do have some problems there, but the blackberries and also the, begins with a C, clematis.
Clematis.
And oftentimes overtopping any plantings we make in a very short period of time. So we're having professionals come in and work on that. The Public Works Department has shade mitigation requirements it has on streams. That is, that they are required actually to make plantings on streams for shade. And some of that is extending outside the city. And so they're working with us that we actually take on that responsibility of bringing in a team to actually do those plantings. The basic reason was that anytime you go into the Beaver Creek area or something like that, and you see a city vehicle doing something there, they get very upset because they wonder if it's part of the growing city, and some of this mitigation has to be done outside the city, and so they don't. They'd rather see contractors dealing with it, and since we've had contacts with landowners outside the city limits, they felt that we would be able to go ahead and perform that service, so that's something else that we're involved in.
So the city is doing plantings outside the city
Apparently, the requirements are to get so much shade, and some of that will extend out, and it's basically an Abernathy Creek is basically, and so yes.
Yeah. I know this, the cold water refugia, is that what it's called, or something on those shading areas?
Yeah, creating shade.
Yeah, Martin mentioned something about that, and I know the county shops building along Abernathy Road, they sit right on the edge of the
They sure do.
And, they've got that channel, and I went down there the other day because they have approached us about wanting to remove some dead tree snags. And so far we've said that, you're in the Natural Resource Overlay District, it's a salmon-bearing stream. We have requirements about that, and prior to any go ahead and do that, we need to know exactly which trees you want to remove and what the condition is. I think their concern is that they're concerned that the trees would fall into this channel of the stream and create some sort of a hydraulic situation that would further scour away the bank next to the shops. But the
The stream is highly incised and
dollars of mitigation, or in stream bank stabilization, as opposed to just removing a few trees and then replanting in the right locations. Anyway, so we're working on that.
Is there another shading alternative they have available to them other than trees?
I don't know. I hadn't thought about that.
I understand their concern because Abernathy is highly incised, and they have problems in other areas on Abernathy.
I was surprised at how incised it was and how steep that bank is. And then when you come up to where Solve did their project, it looks like, they deliberately placed wood in the middle of the channel to create habitat.
Yes.
And so.
Yeah, they'd probably be better off doing some sort of stream bank something versus cutting down and mitigating trees probably.
Yeah, so it's probably gonna need expert analysis is my feeling, and so we'll report back on that. We haven't made a decision yet.
I think they came in naturally, but there's on one side where it should get a heavy current on Abernathy Creek, it's got kind of that dog leg in the stream there. We believe it's red osier dogwood that has actually established itself on the bank, and it's been there for years. So apparently it has some bank stabilizing capabilities. And so maybe, I mean,
Dogwood is a
Maybe-
very good bank stabilizer.
yeah, so it might be that dealing with that is to look at vegetation, the fact that they could plant into the steep bank, but
Okay.
actually survive and hold it in place.
You can get cuttings of red osier and just stick it in the bank, and a certain percentage of them will just root. They roots
Yeah.
really easily, and then that's a way to create bank stabilization and shade for the creek as well at the same time.
Right,
So,
and they grow right over the creek too,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
it is, so.
we're looking at that
I
in
don't know.
restoration in McMinnville that we're doing,
Yeah,
so.
so that might be something they might want to look at.
What time of year do you do
I
that?
believe they usually do the cuttings after they lose their leaves, so in fall and then early spring, the water starts going down, but it's still really wet, you stick them in, and
Okay. Yep.
I can ask Luke, I'll ask Luke.
Yeah, we've also done cuttings in the spring too, that have been,
Yeah.
they're stored over in a refrigerator or whatever in the winter, and then you put the cuttings out in the spring and then.
Okay.
You can buy them from a nursery, you can buy bundles of whatever they call them, stakes, I think. Or you can actually just go out and cut your own and stick them in there too, so.
Okay.
They're gonna have to, I mean, they're having professionals do it because they have to be in that stream and.
Yeah.
Right.
and everything.
Yeah, and then the water level comes up.
Right.
Yeah.
That's why they usually do it spring when it starts going down a little bit.
Okay.
Before it's, when it's really high, you can't get in there and do anything.
Okay.
And if you do it like fall, the odds are you're gonna flood, it's all gonna wash out.
Yeah,
So
that's
they
what I was
usually wait
thinking.
till after the flood season starts, like usually like,
Right.
I think late February, March-ish, maybe even April, depending upon the stream.
Okay. Cool. That's good. That's really helpful. Yeah. Thanks.
I guess that's
Well,
it.
I'll go back over and let you know that Oregon City Parks Foundation we were going to be doing a poll with Solve, has over 100 volunteers, and they were looking at possibly Oregon City to bring those and do a big Solve push. They're gonna do Willamette River on the Willamette side, Westland side instead. Darn, we were gonna have full ivy, but we'll be doing an ivy spraying again in late September. And that'll be the second spraying of Waterboard Park of the 9 acres that we're looking at. And then we'll schedule several more pulls and cutting the ivy off the trees in October, November, and then continue all the way through. And then another spray, the final one, in spring. So then we'll find out what we have to do, and then we're gonna look at some more acreage. I'd give a little overrun on that grant, so we are either going to take and spray more in the Waterboard Park and/or go over to Old Kenema Park and help out there. So, get more on those as we go. And then we've closed up all of our concert seasons with the city parks. That was very successful with us.
Yes.
Yeah, and thank you very much. Boy, come elect, everybody had all their election badges on and started picking up bottles at the concert. I said, come on, election year, get some more volunteers. But that's been really nice. We've, over the course of the year and almost February will be 2 years, we've almost gotten $8,000 in bottles. That's cool.
That's great.
So, and litter.
Excellent. Anything else for the good of the order? Future agenda items. We've discussed a couple of things that are stem from us to come forward. And so anything else that we need to talk about? One thing and I haven't done so yet, but Pete has suggested I sit down with Laura and talk about our desire to have developers that are coming into our Enron areas talk to us, giving us basically the same footing as a neighborhood association. We won't see every development, we just see those that are within the Enrons.
Yeah.
I'm good, I get to talk about my little trees that they might be able to save one or two.
So, yeah,
Well, I overlooked that. We did add a paragraph in the Natural Resources Overlay District Code. I apologize for this.
In which one?
1749. And here's what it says. The public is encouraged to contact the Natural Resources Committee for input and advice on ways to further the purposes of the Natural Resource Overlay District, whether or not a development application is proposed within the district. Any advice given by the Natural Resources Committee is non-binding on the applicant and the Natural Resources Committee and shall not relieve an applicant from compliance with this chapter. In addition to that, we would add this sentence, this paragraph to our pre-application conference notes.
Oh, we didn't read it. Oh, we don't have any authority anyway.
Yep.
Recommend.
It's pretty blunt there, but yeah, it's true.
What do you think of that?
I'm glad it's there. I'll be glad.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
And if your planning department encourages them to do so in the process, that would even be better.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Great.
No, we're,
All right.
it looks like we still took a shorter
Not even
time,
bedtime.
even though.
I got 10 minutes.
Came up in the process.
Just have time to get home, get ready for bed.
Does anyone want to, I guess I